What's up, fellow guitar lovers? Guitar Historian here. Before I start the video, actually today, as I'm filming this video, was the day that Jeff Beck passed away. And I just wanted to say a couple quick words before we get into this video about Jeff. What can you say, honestly? The guy he refused to be put in a box. And as a result, he was the type of guitar player who guitar players know who he is, but a lot of other casual fans might not. And they've probably heard his name, but they just may not know him to the level of notoriety as like an Eric Clapton or a Jimmy Page. But, in reality, he was the guy that they looked up to. So, we definitely say goodbye to Jeff. It was a very sudden death. Apparently, he contracted bacterial meningitis, which can cause brain swelling, and he apparently passed away from the illness pretty quickly. So we reach out to his family and his friends, and we say with a very heavy heart, rest in peace. And obviously, Jeff, you will never be forgotten as a guitar player. Just an absolute withering talent. A guy who makes you want to throw all your guitars into the trash when you listen to him. He's that good. And we have tons of music to remember him by. So let's do that tonight. Listen to some Jeff Beck. But with that, on with the video. Hello there, and welcome back to the Guitar Historian YouTube channel. What is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? What makes it the last word in which musical acts actually get into it and which are kicked to the curb? Since 1986, we've mostly accepted the Cleveland institution in celebrating the best of what rock music has to offer, but who gave it that authority? And why has the Hall seemed to attract more controversy than acclaim over the past few years? Today we will look at the checkered history of the creation and rise of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Next. As many artists such as Chuck Berry, Danny and the Juniors, and Neil Young have said, quote, rock and roll is here to stay. And as the 1980s began, some in the rock world began to look around for a way to honor those acts who built the genre into an enduring musical force, the likes of which the world had never seen. The terminology Hall of Fame was first coined in 1901, when the first organization to use that term was the Hall of Fame for Great Americans, at the campus of New York University. Meant to honor historical men of consequence, its early success led to the creation of Cooperstown's Baseball Hall of Fame, and the other sports and organizations would follow. The general business model of the premise centered around the museum experience and how accepting the general public was about the worthiness of those chosen. In the case of the original Hall of Fame at NYU, initially, anyone could make a nomination, while a board of electors would decide eventually on who made it in. Indeed, the election process would be key to the credibility of these institutions. And in the case of the Rock Hall, well, we're going to get into why that might be a problem for this particular institution. According to Joe Hagan's book, Sticky Fingers, the genesis of a rock music Hall of Fame came from an early cable TV entrepreneur named Bruce Brandwin. Brandwin wanted to package a pay-per-view nostalgia TV special that he called The Kings and Queens of Rock and Roll, in which several artists from the 50s and 60s would perform and be honored for their musical accomplishments. Brandwin and his production company called Black Tie Network had envisioned pretty much every major piece we now know as part of the current Rock Hall, including the yearly induction show, and a museum full of memorabilia and instruments that people could visit year-round. It would be an ad man working for Brandwin named Blake Lorick who suggested that the affair would run better with the more weighty name of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But it seemed that once this name was tacked onto the project, and once the record industry began to stack the board of directors and committees surrounding the fledgling organization, Brandwin's control over his own brainchild began to slip away from him. Brandwin initially reached out to lawyer David Braun, who was Bob Dylan's lawyer, and Braun began to reach out to Atlantic Records executive Ahmet Erdogan to run the new enterprise. Erdogan initially declined, but after a couple of weeks, he began to realize the potential of the venture and would eventually agree. However, Erdogan began to steer the venture into the control of the record companies themselves, and eventually, he and Rolling Stone magazine publisher Jan Wenner would become known as the architects of the Rock Hall. But what Brandwin had in his back pocket was a 5-year deal with Black Tie Network to air the TV special. To combat this, Wenner and Erdogan began to focus more on the museum and memorabilia aspect of the project rather than the TV special. Rather than rushing into the induction of new acts, they instead settled on Cleveland as the site for a massive new museum site and began to hoard more executives and resources to bolster the credibility and name recognition of the new venture. But by 1986, they had no more reasons to drag their feet, and so the first ever induction ceremony of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was filmed at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City. Filmed, but not broadcast. This was part of a beautifully crafted stall, according to Brandwin, who also was forced to watch the same thing happen in 1987. Bruce would say, quote, "When the 5 years expired, they said, 'Your 5 years are up. You've lost your rights.'" Brandwin attempted to sue for breach of contract in 1988 to force the broadcast of the ceremonies, but when he realized his weak case, he would settle out of court. Wenner and Erdogan, for their part, didn't exactly hide from the gambit, with Wenner's lawyer saying years later, quote, "We did take it from the guy. It was easy." Going forward, Ahmet Erdogan would be credited for the inception of the Rock Hall, with Jan Wenner being credited as a co-founder, but it would not be long that Erdogan would take a more behind-the-scenes role, as the experienced and more well-known face of Jan Wenner would become synonymous with the Rock Hall. Wenner was already famous for his founding of Rolling Stone magazine in 1967, which had become influential for introducing many young writers and photographers to the music scene. But the magazine was often criticized for overlooking some of the more fringe elements of rock and music, especially missing the boat on punk and early hip-hop. As the years went on, Wenner would use his name recognition to become a major force in the choice of who got inducted and who didn't. And this power would come to be questioned fairly quickly in the Hall's history, as its first major controversy would surround the most popular act in music history, the Beatles, and its individual members. When the Beatles were inducted in 1988, there was one glaring absence: Paul McCartney. Macca explained that as he and his fellow former Beatles were still, unbelievably, going through legal issues surrounding the breakup of the band 18 years prior, that he would feel it would have been a, quote, fake reunion, and that he'd feel like a hypocrite, waving and smiling with people that he was currently in litigation with. Beach Boy Mike Love, never one to back down from a fight, said that night at the ceremony, quote, "I think it is wonderful to be here tonight, but I also think it is sad that there are other people who aren't here tonight, and those are the people who passed away, and people like Paul McCartney, who couldn't be here tonight because he's in a lawsuit with Ringo and Yoko." Paul's frustration with the Hall didn't end there, however. Wenner, sensing the rift that was forming with McCartney, began to instead ingratiate himself to Paul and Linda, inviting them over for dinner to wine and dine them. But this was really just a ploy to get Paul along on his plan to induct John Lennon to the Hall as a solo artist in 1994. Jan did bag the elephant, with Paul agreeing to do the introduction, but as Paul thought about it, he also wondered why he himself was not being inducted, considering his solo career was nothing to sneeze at either. Wenner informed Paul that he had nothing to do with the induction of the acts, and that, as Paul put it, quote, "This was up to these other people who were down the corridor somewhere." Despite this, as part of the deal, Wenner promised Paul that he would do everything he could to get him inducted as a solo artist the very next year. Wenner would use this induction committee argument many times, but most of the acts who have gone on to talk about the Rock Hall over the years feel that Wenner always had final say over who went in and who did not. Of course, as we all know, Paul would go on to beautifully and emotionally induct his friend John. But as the next year's crops of inductees were announced, McCartney was not included in the acts to be honored. Paul called Wenner and said, quote, "I'm getting all the papers, and I don't appear to be in it, you bastard." Paul went on to say, quote, "We had a deal, a verbal contract that wasn't worth the paper it was written on. so that didn't endear me to him. Macca would have to wait 5 more years for his own induction, tragically a year after the death of his soulmate Linda. Paul's daughter Stella wore a t-shirt that said, "About time." It's interesting that Wenner's Rolling Stone magazine and the Rock Hall, which are so intertwined, saw fit to punish McCartney for so many years. As I covered some time back in my McCartney's Darkest Days video, Rolling Stone has a long history of lauding much of John's solo work while minimizing and panning Paul's. This began with the pair's 1970 releases, John's Plastic Ono Band, which Rolling Stone lauded, and Paul's McCartney, which Rolling Stone promptly destroyed, calling the songs distinctly second-rate. Paul would later say, quote, "It all added to this historical thing, that John was really it in the Beatles, and the other 3 weren't it by implication. To me and John writing, it was so equal, and sometimes it was not equal. Sometimes I was absolutely the one who got his ass out of bed, which I don't go around saying. You won't find me saying, 'Oh, it was me.' I don't want to do that. I'm happy with half credit." It seemed that Paul was constantly fighting to, at the very least, have equal footing on the bill to the departed John, but Wenner and Rolling Stone's pro-John and anti-Paul agenda, and it was an agenda, goes back decades. It even continues to this day, with the magazine recently releasing a countdown of the 200 greatest singers of all time. John Lennon was ranked number 12. Paul McCartney, who I think most would say is an objectively better singer in every way, he was ranked number 26. But getting back to the Rock Hall, whether the induction process was really Wenner's call or not is still a closely guarded secret. But another excerpt from Hagen's Sticky Fingers tells us that, quote, "Now a group of aging record men, every one of them white, with Ahmet Erdogan and Wenner as his sidekick, nominated the artists in a backroom process that was called purposefully non-transparent." But while Wenner would like you and the acts to think that he had nothing to do with the induction process, he was also very quick to take credit for the entire enterprise, saying, quote, "I'm the principal driver of this whole thing. In a sense, it's owned by Rolling Stone. It's a creation of Rolling Stone. It's unfair to some people to say that, but that's what it is. It's my thing." As a result, many acts that Wenner personally disliked were denied entry well past the induction date of 25 years beyond the release of the act's first record. And then there was the epic rant from timeless blues rocker Steve Miller, who finally exposed the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as just another business venture who wasn't interested in actually honoring bands, only in generating as much income from the ceremony as possible. In a backstage presser, Miller railed against the greed of the show organizers, saying, quote, "When they told me I was inducted, they said, 'You have 2 tickets, one for your wife and one for yourself. Want another one? It's $10,000. Sorry, that's the way it goes. What about my band? What about their wives?' This is how close this show came to not happening, because of the way the artists are being treated." Over the years, the Rock Hall has created new positions for early influencers, which has added a number of acts that laid the bedrock foundation for rock. The Ahmet Erdogan Award for Lifetime Achievement was created for non-performers like producers and executives. Finally, the Musical Excellence Award was created for sidemen and other acts who supported main acts in their chase for stardom, like Billy Preston, the E Street Band, Nile Rodgers, and Randy Rhoads. Sounds to me like someone named Mick Ronson should be in that category. The Hall announced a new fan vote, which they claim counts as one vote in the committee of 600 record executive professionals, to give fans the feeling that they had some power over who was inducted. But even this was met with controversy, as the voting process was bogged down by bots and politics almost immediately. Today, most rock fans feel somewhat ambivalent about the Hall, with most of their favorite acts already having been inducted, with many exceptions, of course. And many are left wondering just how long the Hall will continue to be relevant, if in fact it even still is. But the vision of Wenner and Erdogan in setting up the museum before the show has proven to be prescient, as the IMP-designed pyramid in Cleveland still draws many visitors on a regular basis. This is due, in no small part, to the Hall's collection of amazing rock artifacts that allow fans to see their favorite rockers' equipment and clothing up close. They banked on the success of the museum and the show as an added bonus to keep the name relevant. One isn't sure if Bruce Brandwin would have had the same vision or overall business acumen to bring the Rock Hall to the level of fame that they find themselves with today. But it's clear that the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame will continue to be a focus of rock fans' admiration and angst for many years to come. But thanks for joining us once again, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. How do you think Paul McCartney has been treated by Rolling Stone magazine and the Rock Hall over the years? But also, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, as these really help us grow our reach. Be sure to check these other great videos appearing in front of you right now, and consider using YouTube's new Super Thanks feature if you'd like to leave a tip if you really like what you saw. With that, as always, thanks for watching, and we will see you next time.